to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again, I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, a legend, Trevor Keith from the band Face to Face is here, and it's a different kind of journey into punk rock. We get into all that, more on that in 1 second. But first, if you want to get in touch with me, head over to the email address turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he will get the message to me, and we can communicate that way. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Left4Damian. If you want to support the show, the best way to support the show is just by telling all your friends about it, letting everyone know that you enjoy this podcast that we do, and that we do, tons of episodes, and it's not going to let up. You can tell them that, and you can tell them that it's going to be going on for forever. We're going to keep doing it. You can also support the show by subscribing to it and rating it on your podcast platform of choice. And thank you to everyone that does do that. And speaking of thank you, a huge thank you to all the people that go over to patreon.com and support the show over there. Patreon.com/turnedoutapunk. It means a lot. Thank you. And we do some fun stuff over there. There's some footnotes. There's, with Chris O'Toole. There's some secret episodes. There's some fun stuff over there. So head over to patreon.com and check it out. And speaking of support, this thing would not be possible without the kind, loving support of the fine folks at Vans who came aboard a few years ago and said, Damian, we like what you do. Do what you do, but just don't do it out of your own pocket anymore. And they help cover the cost of doing this thing, which is, very much appreciated because, there are some costs. Anyway, thank you very much to Vans for helping me cover those. All right. Also check out over there at floodmagazine.com for Punk as Fuck. Some videos of myself going around the city of Los Angeles, chilling, hanging out with some punk rock luminaries, talking about why that city is so important. We filmed it a few years ago, and there's some great stuff on there. So check that stuff out. Also, Fucked Up has put out Year of the Horse. We're three releases in. I don't know. There's like a lot of movements. So there's a lot of opera speaking. It's very serious. Mike has put a lot of effort into this thing with everyone else, obviously, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that. I'm very, very proud of this song, though. I think this song's incredible. It is an hour and a half, though. So buckle up. The 4th chapter has not come out yet. It's going to be dropping very soon, but check that thing out. It's over there at bandcamp.com/fuckedup. Yeah, let's go with that. That's where it is. Bandcamp.com/fuckedup. I hope that's where it is. You can find it. It's out there. All right, on to today's show. Today on the show, as I said off the top, the legend from Face to Face, Trevor Keith. Now, Face to Face is a band that I saw many, many times over the years and continue to see many, many times over the years. They are a band that were a gateway band for tons, like a whole generation of kids. And Trevor's someone that I've always wanted to talk to about this thing because I knew that he was someone that had a history playing in metal bands and then got into this stuff kind of, later in his early 20s and then ends up forming one of the most important bands that kind of emerged from that California 90s melodic punk scene. And they continue to go. They're just about to release their 10th album. Trevor will talk a little bit more about this on the episode, but it's called No Way Out But Through, which will hopefully be coming out later this year. And they're back on Fat, which is, the home. So everything is right in the world that way too. He also has another project with his kid, which I'm living very much in envy of doing that one day with my kids. Icarus, Daedalus is the name of the project, and it's with his son. And anyway, once again, he talks about that a little bit more on this episode, but check out both of those things and check out all of Face to Face's stuff. They have an incredible catalog, 10 studio albums. There's also live records and EPs. And anyway, this is a fun episode. We talk about some cool stuff. All right, everyone, I'm not going to ramble on anymore. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Trevor Keith on Turned Out a Punk. Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as I was just telling you off air, you are a legend, and, like many other people in this world have had a massive impact on my musical journey, but I got to start this thing off the way they all start off, which is, Trevor, how did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across the genre?
Well, I'm honored. Let me just say, for starters, I appreciate that. That's a really great thing to hear, and it never gets old. Um, Punk rock for me was something that came a little bit later in my life, because when I first discovered punk rock, I didn't immediately gravitate to it. Um, I grew up in an area outside of Los Angeles, far enough out in the sticks, where we were pretty isolated, and our local culture was very heavy metal scene driven at the time, like bands like Iron Maiden and stuff like that. That was what all of my friends listened to. So when I first started hearing about punk rock, I didn't really get it. And probably I was probably 15 or 16. This is like in the 80s.
Mhm.
And so once I had gotten out of high school and I started forming bands, then a buddy of mine turned me on to a Bad Religion record, and I'd never even heard of Bad Religion at that point. And I was like, wait a minute, this is punk rock? This is really awesome. Like, these are great songs, and there's good attitude and great lyrics, and it was just so, everything was so quality about it that I was like, okay, I think I do actually like punk rock now. And then I got turned on to Descendants, and I was hooked at that point. I was like, wait a minute, these are amazing, just syrupy pop songs with like just the best, performance and everything. And it just had so much heart, and it was so immediate and compelling that I found that after I was already, almost 20 years old. I was probably 19 or 20 when I first heard those two bands. My exposure to punk rock previous to that, I think, was bands like Germs and Dead Kennedys and stuff like that, which are great, but I didn't really have an appreciation for that at the time. And so when I found my gateway through bands like Bad Religion and Descendants, which were a little bit later than those other bands, then it made me want to just know everything about punk rock. And then I found an appreciation for the stuff that initially that didn't really hook me in. So yeah, I was probably about 20 years old or so when I finally discovered that there were aspects of punk that I like. And then I just kind of never looked back from there.
It's funny because, like, metal and punk rock, by the time the mid 80s or even the early 80s is kind of happening, it's already splitting off, and it's very faction. But it's funny to look back like a few years earlier, and you have bands like, the Atoms, which had Izzy Stradlin playing beside, members of DFL, or you had like there was like a lot more cross pollination, and like it all comes from the same DNA, right? It's all New York Dolls at the end of the day.
Yeah, it really is. And Ramones
And Motorhead.
Motorhead. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, just throwing in Motorhead, for example, like a lot of people might think of Motorhead as a metal band or a hard rock band, but they were punk rock. Hell, Iron Maiden was considered a punk rock band on their first album, on their self-titled record, even though they're a metal band. But they had the singer Paul Di'Anno on their first record and second record, Killers. He had the short hair. He didn't have the same look as the other guys. And his delivery as a singer was more punk rock, even though the songs were more like progressive, So you're right. There was a whole lot of crossover, especially in the 80s. I know, we talk about the New York Dolls and Ramones and Sex Pistols and even the Clash. That was all late 70s, early 80s. But by the mid 80s, you had a lot of hard rock, metal, and punk rock crossover. And then that's when I was in high school in the mid 80s. I graduated in 1987. I know I'm showing my age, but that era of that kind of conglomeration of punk and metal with bands like DRI and stuff, it wasn't really well defined, I think, until later when it started splitting off. And then, maybe when you were a kid in school, a little bit later in the early 90s, you had your metal kids and your punk kids, and they didn't really get along. You had the factions starting to split up.
Yeah, I think even by the time I was getting into it, it was even less interesting than that. Like by the time I was, it was still, there was still like vestiges of that kind of world, but like more I think it almost like post Nirvana, it changed everything, right? Because it kind of turned. It seems like it just turned music upside down in a way, like, so kids were just into everything. There was no. I think it
Yeah.
really opened a floodgate again for a minute.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. The lines definitely with grunge and all that, the lines got blurred again.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, I think they, in the '90s when we were coming up, uh, there was like the underground punk rock and what would become, I guess, pop punk, defined a little bit later in the '90s.
Mm-hmm.
But by the 2000s, everything kind of conglomerated back again into a mixture of things.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very cyclical that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Going back before that, where were you kind of getting into these bands? Like, obviously, I guess Iron Maiden's not being played on the radio or anything. So where were you kind of getting into the metal stuff?
Just from friends, that was like what the people that I hung out with in school and everything listened to. And it was just the culture at the time.
Were there any local bands? Like,
Oh, yeah. We had some really hilarious local bands where I grew up. We had a band called Black Dove that billed themselves as the band who eats glass, which is just incredible.
Did they literally eat glass?
No, but that's what they wrote on their flyers whenever they would do kegger parties or whatever. Like I said, I was out in the sticks, so you saw local bands if you went out to a kegger party, which usually consisted of like an old house foundation slab in the middle of the desert somewhere, and people would bring in a bunch of generators and the band would set up on the concrete and there'd be kegs of beer and it was just a free-for-all, and you stayed there until the cops came and broke it up.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was fun. It was crazy. They got pretty crazy sometimes. But yeah, it was pretty fun. There weren't really any bands of note, I don't think, that came out of that time period, the local bands, but everyone was trying to emulate the music of the day, and it was mostly metal, those bands. I think when we started off as a metal band, Matt and I, at first, we had a band called Victoria Manor that was basically, we were trying to imitate Iron Maiden, and then that band kind of fizzled out. We lost our drummer and guitar player, and when Matt and I decided to form a new band, what would become Face to Face, we were almost like a new wave band at that point. We sounded more like The Cure or Psychedelic Furs and that kind of stuff, the music we were also listening to side by side with metal.
That's like the Zero Tolerance demo. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off with that.
Yeah, and it's hilarious because we called the band Zero Tolerance, which we found out was a hardcore band from I think Boston or somewhere in New England. Buffalo. Okay.
And actually, Darren Pfeiffer was the drummer in the second kind of lineup when they did a 7-inch.
Oh, was he really? I never knew that. That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Very, very small circle, this punk rock world.
Yeah, it is. So we once we found out there was another band, and this is pre-internet, so you find out by, scouring as many zines as you can, and then if you see your band name in there, you're like, oh crap, we can't use that name anymore, especially if they put a record out before you. So we settled on Face to Face, not knowing that was a 80s pop band from Boston. That was the Boston connection. And we wouldn't find that out until many years later. By then it was too late for us to change our name, and that band had broken up, shortly after they formed.
Wow, so, I never heard of Face to Face from Boston. You stumped me with that one.
Yes, well, look it up sometime. They're out there on the internet, and Laurie Sargent was the singer. They were a very kind of poppy dance band. Nothing like what we are. So it's pretty different. If you stumble on the wrong Face to Face, you'll know in an instant, Mm-hmm. But yeah, we trying to get away from that metal and trying to do something different. We were doing more of this like new wave stuff, and then like I said, I started listening to Bad Religion and Descendants, and even Fugazi at the time. I got turned on to the first two Fugazi EPs, and I was like, what? My mind was blown. I was like, this is amazing. I love this stuff. It didn't have that pop sensibility, but it just had so much heart, and it to me, it was like art rock or something, because the arrangements were very unique and original and the rhythms were cool. And so those three bands really were my entry and my big influence in the very beginning of Face to Face. Of course, I like Social Distortion too. That was a pretty easy move. Mainly not for the songs even as much as just the vibe, because the band just was so cool, you know, with that whole retro kind of slash rockabilly vibe. And so yeah, those actually, I should include all four. Those four bands had a lot to do in influencing the songs we wrote for our debut album, Don't Turn Away. And because of those bands, we got more aggressive with our music. So it changed from like this new wave thing, even though the songs still had pop structures, but we went faster with the tempos, a little bit more distorted, a little bit more aggressive, but we still had like a pop sensibility in there too. And we just, by the time we had formulated that sound, we just loved it for ourselves. There weren't a lot of bands that we know of that were actually doing it at the time. Doesn't mean it wasn't happening, because it was everywhere. But being isolated and not really knowing what we were doing, we were just trying to make music that made us happy, you know. And then we just would go out and play, and we'd watch other punk rock bands go out and play, and you know, we'd see stage diving and circle pits and all that kind of shit that we weren't really exposed to growing up. And we'd have to travel like to LA or Orange County and stuff and to see that. And, you know, it had been around for a decade at that point, but it just wasn't much we were exposed to in our, you know, growing up. And then, yeah, it just was something that just fit so well with where we were as young adults at the time. And you know, just, like I said, we just never looked back.
So did Victoria Manor or Zero Tolerance play outside of Victoriaville?
Victoria Manor never played outside of Victorville. As Zero Tolerance, I think we might have done a show or two at this venue in Riverside called Spanky's, which was kind of the Inland Empire punk rock club, you know.
Yeah, I think I've heard of it. I've seen flyers, definitely, maybe.
Yeah, that was the spot. And it was only about maybe a 40-minute drive for us from where we lived. I think we did a gig or two. I know our first show we ever did, we called ourselves Zero Tolerance, and that was at a kegger party, you know, in a warehouse. But we pretty quickly changed our name to Face to Face. So
who was
probably Zero Tolerance was us as a three-piece. It was me and Matt, of course, who formed it, and then we found Rob, who would become our drummer. And then by the time we were kind of changing into Face to Face, Rob had a buddy that he recommended we should try out. So he came down and played guitar, adding the second guitar, and we loved the way it sounded. But at the time, he was active duty in the military, in the Air Force, and even though we'd written some songs together and had played some shows as a four-piece, he got called to Desert Storm at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
And so he was in Bahrain. You know, he was gone for 6 months, 9 months. And after he came back, we tried to make it work with him. But at that point, we had just kind of formed this thing with the three-piece Face to Face, and it was working well. And after 6 or 9 months, and then having you know, the guitar player come back, it just didn't really work for us. So we parted ways, and we just continued on as a three-piece until all the way up until 95, when we did our second album, Big Choice.
So who were you playing with in Zero Tolerance? Was it just kind of like any band you could, or was there like a scene of kind of similarly like-minded, kind of like, you know, bands that are looking to sort of like old wave and new wave stuff?
Well, I'll mention the band name. They were the same bands we would continue to play with as we became more of a punk rock band. I don't know if anyone listening will know these bands. Well, Voodoo Glow Skulls and Guttermouth are probably the most well-known because they still exist and they're still putting out music and playing shows. Mm-hmm. But then there were some other local scenester kind of bands like Flying Moco and Old Nick and Das Clown.
Oh,
And
Das Clown, I know. Like Lethal Aggression Records, right? Like that kind of scene.
well, yeah, that kind of stuff. Doctor Strange Records,
Yeah.
Lethal Aggression. Then we would try to get out as far as we could. So occasionally we play in LA, but that was always a tough nut to crack. We became buddies with Brandon from Harmful as Swallowed. We played with them a bunch. We used to play the Anti Club a lot. We even made our way out to Ventura and Oxnard and played with Ill Repute, and kind of got into that whole vibe a little bit. And just we were trying to expand our influence as much as we could. So, but that Inland Empire scene was really the core. Playing Spankies and playing with some of those bands I mentioned earlier.
It kind of seems like, from what people have said that have been on the show, that it's really like a rebuilding period that's going on in the late 80s into the early 90s, like before the punk rock boom that you're all a part of. That, like, there wasn't much kind of left throughout the late 80s in terms of punk rock in kind of like Southern California. Like, did it feel like that? Like, was it kind of like, could you feel like more and more kids coming out to shows as things went on? Like, obviously as a band that normally happens, but could you feel like kind of a groundswell of energy around this music?
Yeah, and not initially. I mean, initially we were just trying to make a band that we liked and trying to make songs that we thought were cool. But in a way, in Southern California, at least at that time, we sort of felt like we were doing it in a vacuum, and the more we would learn about the scene, it always seemed like we were learning about bands that were doing stuff just right before us, but then weren't really very active anymore. You know what I mean? So, and you got to remember, like, all the cool scenes from other parts of the country. Like, I think in New York, hardcore was already well established and raging and going on. And then you had the DC scene and all that. But California, you had like your DIs and bands like that, but they weren't super active, So like the first show we ever did at Spanky's, we opened for Jawbox, and that was like the kind of stuff that was happening at the moment. But pop punk was kind of flying under the radar. And I remember there was a record store right a door or two down from Spanky's, and I went in there and I said, hey, I just found this band Big Drill Car, and I really think they're cool. What other bands can you recommend that are like Big Drill Car? And the guy was like, well, have you heard of Green Day? I was like, no. And he gave me Green Day's debut album at the time. And I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. This exists too. And so I became a big Green Day fan early on. And then we were lucky enough to do shows with them in the very beginning, like before Dookie came out, when they were still kind of like a garage band or whatever. And then we were playing shows with Offspring at, places like Munchies and Pomona and Anti Club and stuff like that too. So of course, those two bands in particular would go on to explode in the 90s and become some of the most well-known bands even still from that movement. But I don't think anyone really knew it was a movement at the time. It was very strange. I think there were just a bunch of bands out there doing it.
I love that, late 80s, early 90s period you're kind of discussing, where like, you have bands like, Neurosis playing with No Effects and stuff. Like, it was really like we were talking about earlier, like that was like almost like punk rock. Like, it wasn't big enough yet for all these bands to kind of exist in their own world. So everyone was kind of like, you're playing with Jawbox, for instance. Like, it's kind of cool that it was so diverse at that point, because it was small.
It really was, and it couldn't be defined. We played with Jawbreaker at the Claremont colleges once, and I was already listening to Jawbreaker at the time, so I was thrilled. We played with them right when their Bivouac record, the second album, came out, and that was awesome. And then we'd play with 15. We'd play with Mr. T Experience and Pop Sicko and all those kind of bands from that time. So Yeah, it was a lot more mixed before bands kind of broke out and defined their own movements on their own, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's almost like really reflected on that Rhetoric Records label that you did that split with Horace Pinker on.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Hmm.
You go through that catalog, and it's like a who's who of underground music, but like in vastly different worlds.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
it's
because
oh, sorry.
we were all hustling, you know, we were
Mhm.
all just trying to find. I think for us, I wouldn't say we were hustling necessarily, but I was looking for any opportunity for our band to just play someplace in front of people, you know. And if you met a guy along the way that was like, "Hey, do you want to do a split 7-inch with Horace Pinker?" I was like, "Sure, why not?" You know, they're
Yeah,
friends of ours. We play shows with them
yeah.
occasionally, and you know, we were definitely playing tons of club shows with Horace Pinker at the time. So it just made sense.
They're a great band, and they're really, like, I guess because they were never on. I don't know, like it's weird how they're kind of not really brought up in the same way that a lot of other bands are, because they're like you're saying, they're a great band.
Yeah, they were awesome. There was another band called Fuel
Oh
out
yeah.
of San Francisco that I played that CD until I just wore holes in it. I love that CD so much.
Well, there's a
And,
Toronto connection too, because they did a split with Flight Camp from here.
oh, they did. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I
Yeah,
love
that's
that band
right.
so much. Fuel is yeah, and really, like, a band that sort of set for, like, for a particular style of pop punk, but like, that later Hot Water Music and Against Me and all sorts
Yep.
of other bands were kind of like the gruffer vocal approach to it.
Yeah. Now, the some of the guys from Fuel ended up reforming into another band. I'm gonna have. I don't know if I remember. Do you remember what that band was called?
No, is it
That was
Monsula
also
maybe?
great.
Oh, I'm trying to
What
think
was it?
what it is. I'll fix it in the intro if we can't come up with it.
Yeah, if you can think of it. Yeah, cool. But yeah, I don't know. It was like you said, it was just a lot of different bands all kind of coming up around the same time, and I think it was exciting because it felt new,
Mhm.
um, and no one really knew where it was where any of it was heading. But it was great. I mean, we played with so many cool bands in the beginning, you know, and that, so yeah, that's kind of like our very early entry into the punk rock world.
So, what was the first show you remember where, like, you experienced that kind of slamming and that kind of like that punk rock energy that you guys were taking in for your band? Or do you remember that? Like, was there a moment where, things were kind of clicking?
Yeah, pretty early on, which was very encouraging, you know, and
Mhm.
that was gave us the energy to want to keep doing it, because we were all working full-time jobs during the day. And then, you know, you'd get off at 5 or 6. Or at least me and Matt were, or actually Rob too, we were working construction jobs, which were physically demanding. And then, you know, you'd come home, shower, we'd load our gear, drive an hour to wherever we were going to play, because we lived far from all these cities. And it'd be like a Wednesday night, and you'd get in, sound check, play your set. By the time you're leaving, it's midnight. You got to drive an hour back home, unload all your gear, get up at 6 o'clock to go to work the next day in construction. And we were doing that a few nights a week. So we fed off of that energy, and it was probably those early shows at Spanky's, I would say. Not the first or second time we played, but like the third, fourth, and fifth time that we played, when we started seeing people react to our songs that we had written and been playing in our practice space that no one had really heard at the time. Then everybody was just like kind of looking at each other, just sort of blown away, like, shit, is this really happening? This is so cool. It's amazing. It's exactly what we were hoping for. And so, yeah, I would say probably, you know, pretty early on, we saw people at least pogoing and, you know, starting to mix it up, and a circle forming a little bit. Stage diving, I don't think was that big of a thing when we were playing venues that are like 200 people,
Yeah.
150, 200 people. But as the crowds got bigger, then more of that element started to come in too. And it was just, I don't know, the energy that comes from all of that. You just feed off of it, and there's nothing else like it.
Well, it's amazing how that eventually is like starts to become like almost like a learned behavior. Like people are witnessing it on TV, and then from that they're like bringing it to the shows. Like it almost like
Right? But like,
amplified it.
this is what you do at a
Yeah,
punk rock show.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like MTV, I can remember at the time, like I'm sure much music did, but I certainly remember being on vacation watching stuff on MTV that was like, what is moshing, and explanations on like what you should do if you went to a show. So it was like, okay, well, this is gonna get a lot bigger now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, I thought once we started going to the point of our band where labels, A&R people were starting to come to our shows and watch us, then I just thought it was so cheesy, because here you have these people that are so completely removed from what's actually happening at the shows. They're there with an agenda to see, well, oh, can I sell some records? Look at how many kids showed up or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd be like, well, it's really great how the kids mosh or whatever. And I'd be like, shut the fuck up, man. You don't even know what you're talking about. You wouldn't know moshing, or, number one, you're calling it moshing. And that's a term that comes from, I can't even think of the band I'm trying to think of. Anthrax.
Oh yeah, on the mosh.
Mosh, caught a mosh and all that. So I don't know. It just seemed like a way for people who are really square and didn't really know anything about punk rock to try and make a connection with it,
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd see like A&R guys try to get on stage and stage dive, and the crowd would part and they would eat shit on the floor. You just laugh.
You got it. That's true dedication. If you're willing to risk life and limb,
You
want to sign a band.
It is, yeah, it is.
That's some old music industry shit. I don't think A&R people are really.
Oh God, no, not these days.
Not these days. When another thing that keeps coming up on this show, particularly about this time period, well, prior to this in Los Angeles and that kind of area, is that there was a lot of violence at shows. Obviously, it's become almost legend at this point. Did you see that when you were starting to go to these shows and you guys were starting to play out? Was it, or that already kind of subsided, or was it always present?
No, it was there. It was there for us. I wouldn't. I can think of a handful of times where we did shows that got really violent, and they weren't usually shows we were headlining, and they weren't the small club gigs, but it was when the show started to get a little bit bigger. It's like 1,000, 1,500 people, even 2,000. And that's when these promoters were starting to put the bands together that had the good draws, right? So, these little small festivals that would come up. We did a festival called the Pig Fest in, I think it was in Temecula once, and a massive riot broke out. And as a matter of fact, some of the guys from one of the bands who were playing, Old Nick, were in the crowd, and the guitar player just got beat up really, really badly, like within an inch of his life, because of this riot that broke out. So that was some pretty awful violence. We did another festival at Glen Helen that was actually on the local news and everything. Wow. There were tons of bands on it, from Cadillac Tramps to Guttermouth to us to Voodoo Glow Skull. Like, everybody was on it.
Yeah.
And we were one of the last bands of the night to play. I don't think we were the very last band, but we were in the last 2 or 3. And by the time we came on, people just rushed the stage and were taking gear off the stage, and it just turned into a full-blown riot. And so that was scary. That turned into a mess. Another time, we played a venue called Patriotic Hall with Vandals and Pennywise. And I think Voodoo might have been on that one too. I'm not trying to draw a connection to voodoo and violence, though.
No,
that doesn't exist. But yeah, dude, that was another one where and it was usually the fault of the promoter in most of these cases. Mm-hmm. In this one, I remember specifically the promoter sold out the tickets in pre-sales, and then he went ahead and sold at the door because he got a line of people the night of the show. So he just started selling tickets at the door. The venue filled half full. He took half of the pre-sales, and then half of the other people that bought pre-sales were outside, and he just shut and locked the doors and said, "We're at capacity, you can't come in." and people just went nuts outside, started lighting trash cans on fire and throwing them at cars, and it was scary, man. That was a really scary night. But I do remember some other stuff too, like what would happen a lot. You're making me remember now because it's been a while.
I don't normally find that's the thing with the show. It's almost like
I have an old brain.
Yeah.
So what I do remember, a problem we would experience frequently, and I think frequently, and a lot of other punk rock bands had this, is when you would go and play venues and they would hire security at these venues that didn't understand what the audiences were going to do. And so some of the security guys would get all like threatened and pumped up, and they would take what was happening in the crowd as like a threat of violence, and then they would in turn become violent with the kids, not realizing that the people in the audience were having fun, and they know how to have a circle pit, and they know how to pick people up when they fall down. And the crowd usually polices itself, and they do a pretty damn good job at it 90% of the time. But I remember one show we did in Fresno. I think it was at the Cadillac Club. And there weren't even that many people there, man. There was probably maybe about 100 people at the most, maybe slightly more. So a circle pit broke out, and it was a big round one with not many people. It was large in size, but because the crowd wasn't very big, it was just sparse, And the security guard right in front of me in the barricade, he waited for a guy to come around, and right as he was running around toward him, put out his fist and just clocked him right in the forehead. And I watched the guy's head split from his hairline all the way down to his eye, right on the punch. And I almost threw up. It was so disgusting and shocking to see that happen, like right in front of you,
Yeah.
And we immediately stopped the show. And I think we walked off stage and just didn't even play anymore. Because we're like, we can't play a venue if your security is going to beat up the audience that paid money to come and see the band. I mean, this is, and it's happened a million times throughout our career since, but this was actually in one of the early days. So that was frequently a problem.
Well, it's like you said, like we were talking about, like as the stuff's kind of coming in and people are learning about it and how to do it, like, the knowledge wasn't necessarily being passed to these people doing security. Yeah. Like, so they weren't prepared for it. They had no idea what was going on. Like, I remember being at shows and they were like security guards talking about how the audience were fighting each other. And it's like, no, everyone's just moshing. It's like, it's okay. Like,
right.
And it's almost like they were like the gasoline on the fire a lot of the times.
Yeah, because once the audience started seeing someone being aggressive toward them, then they would start getting mad. And then a lot of times that would erupt in like a riot or a big, bunch of violence would break out. And, this was early. We didn't travel with a road crew or anything, Nowadays, we have a tour manager, for a long time. And the tour manager has a security meeting before the show, and he talks to the security and says, hey, our fans will do X, Y, and Z. We don't want you stepping in unless it gets to this level, but Trevor's going to handle the audience. If they get up on stage and he doesn't want them there, he's going to let you know, but he's going to handle it first. I don't want security up there cracking skulls the minute someone sets foot on stage. I know how to run my stage when the band is performing, and I can usually easily shoo people off, and then it's part of the show and it's fun and there's no aggression happening. You know what I mean? So, a lot can be solved through doing those things, but you learn that over time. So a band has to learn how to do that, and then the venue has to learn it too. So it's just those kind of growing pains, but it might have something to do with what we were talking about earlier, is even though punk rock was already 12, 15 years old, strictly speaking at this point, this newer wave, I guess, was maybe call it like the third wave of punk rock. In a lot of ways, we kind of felt like we were doing it in a vacuum because we were playing venues where people didn't know what punk rock was, and bouncers really didn't get it. And you had promoters that were willing to stick their neck out because they were fans of the music. A lot of times they were guys that had labels or worked at record stores or whatever and just wanted to bring the bands in, but they didn't always have the influence or experience to be able to handle all aspects of it.
So is that kind of like roster on Doctor Strange, kind of that scene, like, Guttermouth, Luda Glow Skulls, Rhythm Collision as well, I guess. Like, was that kind of like the early scene that you guys were a part of in the beginning? Obviously, in the very beginning, I mean.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We all played together a lot of times. We play together constantly. Also, Rhythm Collision too.
Yeah,
We played with them a bunch too in the beginning.
a great band too. Another band that's also like, not really brought up, and just there's so many great records, tons of stuff they put out.
Yeah, Rhythm Collision was an early influence on me because I watched them and I was like, oh, these songs are so well made. Like these are great hooks and good harmonies, and the band just delivered, So I think a lot of what helped us hone in ultimately what we would feel is a good developed sound is by being there and learning and watching from all these other great bands.
So how long is it before you start, heading out and seeing, playing other places? Other
We
than Southern California type thing.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, it was really just Southern California. And then maybe after 6, 9 months time, we decided to pool our money together and buy a van. And then we would road trip up to San Francisco, maybe play a Bakersfield or a Fresno. We played Gilman Street a couple of times, I think.
Mhm.
And then I think we went up as far as like Reno. We didn't venture out too far because they were always like weekender things, whatever we can get off of work. I felt like we were really like stepping out the first time we went all the way to Phoenix for a show. It was like, ooh, we're leaving the state. We're actually playing out of state for a show. This is so cool. And then not long after we released Don't Turn Away and we were kind of getting out and playing more, we met, who did I meet? I met Tim from the band The Grimm. So he goes by Tim Grimm, another Oxnard band, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And because we were doing shows with Ill Repute, and Carl, the drummer for Ill Repute, super, super cool dude. He's like, hey, I know you guys drove a long way to Ventura. You're more than welcome to crash at my house after the show. So we stayed at his place and Tim was there. And I remember we were hanging out after the show and he's like, so what are you guys doing? Like, what do you want to do? And we're like, well, we want to tour. We just put out this record and all this stuff. And he goes, well, I work with the guys in NoFX and Mike just started this label. And I think he would probably be really interested in signing you guys for his label. And I was like, yeah, man, put me in touch with him. So he gave me Mike's number. And a couple of weeks later, I called him and I said, hey, man, I got your number from Tim. And he said I should give you a call because you have a new label that you're doing. And we are frustrated at Doctor Strange because we see that people like the record and they want to get it, but we already sold out of this pressing and I don't know when we're going to get more. And I don't know if they're in stores and all this kind of stuff. And Mike's like, yeah, send me a copy. So we sent it to him and he listened and he called back and he was interested. And so that opened a lot of doors, or it opened a large door, I should say, because then once we were on Fat Records, then of course the huge benefit of that is being able to play shows with NoFX. And so because of that, we got to tour Europe with Lagwagon. We opened for NoFX in Salt Lake City, and then they took us on a tour that was through Canada and parts of the US. It dropped down.
And you played Toronto, you guys in 10-foot pole.
Yeah, it was us. I mean, it was NoFX, 10-foot pole face to face.
Yeah.
I think it was just the three bands, right? There wasn't a fourth on it.
Yeah, unless there was another legs, but certainly in Toronto, it was just the three.
There could have been local openers here and there. But that was our first real tour. I mean, we did tour Europe before that, but that was such a culture shock, weird thing for us. I don't know if any of us really count that. It was just so bizarre. Because here we are. The only show we'd ever done outside of California was a Phoenix show in Arizona. And then we jumped on a plane and flew to Germany and did a tour for 2 or 3 weeks. So that was
what was that? Who were you playing with there? Like, what was that like?
That was a trial by fire. Well, initially we thought we were going to go with NoFX. And then we realized kind of right before the tour that it was really a Lagwagon tour, and which was great because Lagwagon had already been over with No Effects multiple times, and they were at the level now where they wanted to start headlining in Europe. So we were their main support on their first headline tour right after the Trashed record came out. And so that was actually a really great tour. The guys were super friendly and super fun to hang out with, and you know, they would let us ride with them, and we all slept on the floor of the promoter's flat together and stayed in youth hostels, and you know, it was cool. It was punk rock. But it was, like I said, it was a massive culture shock, you know, because none of us had even really been out of the country. So when we got back and we toured with No Effects through Canada, that felt a little bit more like what we were used to, except even in Canada, I guess, seemed just slightly less exotic after going to Germany. Yeah. That was the first new country we traveled to. We might have been weirded out by Canada, I guess. But
Canada's kind of like America crossed with Germany too, when you think about it. So it's like you know, you kind of experienced it already.
Yeah, I feel like one half of Canada is you know, familiar enough for Americans, the Western half. And then you get into the French Canadian side, it feels a lot more like Europe on that side.
Yeah, definitely.
So you get a little bit of both there, which is cool. And we loved Canada. I mean, the audiences were so good, and it was like, you know, we would come out and play, and they would listen for 2 or 3 songs, and by the 3rd or 4th song, people were in, you know, almost every night, and we're like, oh, this is like the best shit ever. So that tour was the thing that I think really opened it up for us. And then, you know, people were talking about our band, and they kind of knew who we were at that point. And so I would say that was kind of the real turning point for us, going from like clubs to being a touring band.
It's funny also, like, talking about Fat Records, like how Mike came out with that label and just did it on like a different scale. Like he was just like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, and it's not going to be like anyone's done an independent punk label before. Like, you know, just like, you know, bands that have come on that were signed to that label early on, like him coming in when they were recording the record, being like, yeah, let's sign a contract, like all this kind of stuff, where it was just, you know, on a like you're saying, it's like a different level of professionalism, where those records were everywhere.
Oh yeah, their distribution was amazing, and they had the capability to get the record everywhere, and because of No Effects, not unlike how a lot of other labels came out. I mean, I think Fat Mike was watching Epitaph, and he was like, I want to do that. I think I can do that. I can do it my own way, make it cool. So you know, it was the thing. I mean, we went from Fat being really our first actual label in terms of distribution and sales, to making a bunch of other records, and then eventually coming back to Fat Records after working with all those other labels. And the great thing about that is, even though Fat had grown immensely over those 25 years, it's still run by Mike and Aaron, and it's still run with the utmost level of, you know, fairness, credibility, cooperation. You never get the sense being at Fat Records that you're going to be ripped off or that anyone's doing anything shady. Everyone is just, you know, they're cool. It's kind of like we were welcomed back like the prodigal sons that we were, you know what I mean? But there was no judgment whatsoever. It wasn't like, oh, so you went out there and you did your major label thing and that failed, so now you're going to come crawling back to us. There was never any speak like that. It was just like, yeah, let's hear your new music. And I played it for them, and they're like, fuck yeah, let's make this record, you know? And in some ways it was almost like no years had passed at all, just because everybody was so welcoming and so cool coming back. So after all the other experiences I'd had with other record labels, including some major labels, it just felt great to know that this kind of record label, this specific record label existed, and they were still willing to work with us and put out our music because, just it feels like home.
Yeah, like and no one, other than sort of interpersonal issues, no one's ever come on here that's been on Fat, and even people that have left it and said bad things about the label. Like it's always been that label's run in a very professional way, that you are paid
Yep.
what you're supposed to be paid, and you never feel like, yeah, like you're saying, you're being ripped off.
Dude, we put out Don't Turn Away, and I think Bill Plaster from Doctor Strange, I think he sold something on the order of, oh God, I want to say it was like a $12,000 buyout or something. Insignificant amount of money. I think we sold a few thousand records.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to recoup that buyout, obviously.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
We were seeing royalty checks within a year of that record being released on Fat. And I've seen a royalty check for Don't Turn Away every 6 months ever since Fat Records has put that out, without fail. There's never been a missed royalty check.
Yeah.
They're just like, they're like clockwork. So, they truly care about doing a good job and putting out great music. And that's why they're as successful as they are. They never lost sight of that. They never sold to, Capitol Records or whatever and let some other giant corporation just come in and mow them down and take them over. I'm sure there were offers. There had to have been throughout the years for probably large sums of money. But, I love that it's just been run essentially by the same people with the same vision for all this time.
Well, going back to, the very first EP on Fat, what was it like working with Giza X?
Well, that EP actually was not a Fat Records EP.
Oh, really? Oh, I had no idea. Okay.
No, that was still on Victory. That was on Victory Music after we had left.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. It was reissued by Fat. That's what I'm thinking of. Maybe.
Okay. It might have been at some point. So we'd left Fat at that. We did one album for Fat, and at the time I was looking for something more out of a record deal. And although Mike made us an offer to do a second album, we entertained other offers too. And I think at the time Fat was still growing, obviously. So they were a smaller label. And it didn't make a lot of sense for Mike or Fat Records to offer us a bigger advance than they did. But we were getting offers from other labels for quite a bit more money. So we decided to try our hand with a different label. And because the advance, helped us to be able to leave our jobs for a couple of months and go on tour and do that kind of thing. And so we went to this label called Victory Music, not to be confused with the Victory Records, the hardcore label. And that was a mess, man. It was a mess. The A&R guy found Giza X for us to go and record and make the Over It EP with. And the Over It EP was a way for us to, basically, they told us at the label what they wanted to do. They had just gotten new distribution through Polygram, and A&M Records was going to be the marketing department for them because they were a mid-level label, and they used the other major label company, their parent companies, to run it through their marketing and their distribution. So they said, do you guys just have some songs? Can you maybe just make an EP? And then we can go run it through our distribution so that we can work the bugs out on the EP, so that when it comes time to do a full-length record, we're not making mistakes, which I guess is a cool idea, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence in the label. Right? So that's the Giza X EP, Over It. He recorded a bunch of songs for Over It. We re-recorded Disconnected. I think we have I Want on there. We have some other B-sides and stuff. And I barely remember recording with Giza X. I know Chad had just joined the band at that time, and we were kind of hazing him because we didn't know Giza X, but Chad had never really been in a professional recording studio recording for a record label, so he was super nervous. Mm-hmm. And And he knew he was going to be put on the spot, and he'd be playing guitar by himself, and Geza X was going to be watching him and, trying to get performances out of him. So we pulled him aside before he started recording, and we're like, dude, don't look in his left eye, because he has some kind of an injury. And if you look in his left eye, he'll know you're looking at his eye that kind of wanders a little bit, and he'll get really pissed at you and like yell at you. Which of course was entirely untrue, but it just added to all of the anxiety of Chad. And then we just sat back in the control room and laughed our asses off, because he couldn't even barely play his guitar parts. He was so nervous and freaked out by the story. And he wouldn't look up. He wouldn't even look toward the control room because of the eye thing.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, it was pretty. That's what I remember about recording with Geza X. I'm sorry. That's like the only real memory I have of that.
So from Victory Records, like you went to A&M, right? Was that like a foregone conclusion that you wanted to stay with a major at that point, or was there other offers you're kind of entertaining between the two records?
Well, it was. We got a manager at that point that was experienced and wanted to. He said, "Look, he came in after we'd already put Big Choice out, and we had a manager previous to that, but he was somewhat inexperienced, and he was doing the best he could. I just don't really know that he was helping us make the best decisions for the band. But for us, going from no manager to any manager was a huge jump. But we severed ties with our first manager after the second album, and our new manager said, look, what I'd like to do, since you're on Victory, but Victory is essentially their parent company is A&M, I'd like to see if I can just get you moved over to A&M. So it was kind of this upward move, but still within the same organization. But so we didn't go sign with A&M. We didn't go get a new deal. we did, there was paperwork, but it wasn't like, hey, we just got signed by a major. We were almost kind of adopted by the major because we were already part of that thing. So anyhow, that's how that came about. And at the time, I wanted to be on a major label. I mean, I knew full well that all the stories of everyone who had come before us and everyone we knew in music and bands that had experience working with majors, and it was like, don't go to that fucking corporate label, they're pieces of shit and they're going to screw you over. And yeah, that happens all the time. But I was, pretty stubborn, and I wasn't going to believe anything until it happened. And I had the it's not going to happen to us mentality. And ultimately it did. It's very cliche. Like the very thing everyone warned us about is pretty much exactly what happened. That label botched everything about our third album. And our third album was really poised to potentially be the record that, took us from that level we were at, which was great, but could have, really elevated our status. I will say that the one good thing from Victory is that they managed to get our song Disconnected on the radio, and we got radio airplay in the US and Canada. And it was awesome. And I think that little boost early on in our career has given us a lot of extra, momentum to still be continuing in the way that we are today. So that was something Victory definitely did right, but it was a person in A&M's radio department who got it on, who got it on K-Rock initially. So then with all that radio momentum, it seems like a no-brainer that we'd have a single for our follow-up album, our third record, the self-titled one. And, because of ego and internal struggle, the single went to K-Rock, and K-Rock they were playing it, they were playing it on their Furious 5 at 9 or whatever their test stuff is for new music. But the label didn't want it there that early because they had set a release date for summer, and this was happening, I believe, like in February. And so we took a meeting with the record label. We took a meeting with the radio department and A&R and everybody. I remember we were sitting at this big, gigantic, long boardroom table, and we didn't do any of the talking. We let our manager talk, and he said, look, we have radio right now I think we should move the release date up. And the people at A&M acted like that was a friggin' act of God, like it was going to be impossible to do. And he's like, look, if we don't move up our release date, we'll probably lose the radio right now that they're giving us for the song. It was for I Won't Lie Down. And so the label was stubborn and would not move the release date up despite our begging and pleading. And K-Rock got off of it. They just dropped it. And then when they released it and A&M's radio department went back to K-Rock with Blind as another single, K-Rock went, nah, you had your chance. We're moving on to other bands. Call us when you make a new album. So that was a massive opportunity lost on that record. And that was my experience of being on a major label, you know? So we toured for 2 years on that album. And we made lots of progress as a band. We really built our following up, despite the lack of radio. It was still a big record for us, and we worked really hard and toured nonstop. And we were willing to tour a third year on the record. And then the label just said, "Nah, we're going to pull your tour support. We think you've done everything you can on this record, and you should just come in off the road and quit touring." And so that, you know, that was a bummer. That was our major label disillusionment bum out. And so then we made a live record, and then we completely restructured and took a look inward and decided we wanted to do something 180 degrees different. And we wrote songs and released the record Ignorance is Bliss, which was a big switch over for our band musically.
Yeah, I guess that's a trade-off with, like, you know, going back, like Big Choice was everywhere. Like there's a Filipino pressing of the tape even, you know,
Yeah.
like it's like, but the trade-off is like when something's that big, they just, it's like a monolith that can't pivot when you need to pivot on something like that.
Right. Right. Yeah. So we were actually, before we made Ignorance is Bliss, we were saying maybe we should make this a side project and just release the record, because creatively and artistically, we really wanted to make that music, and we were all real dedicated to it, and we loved the process. We loved the songs, super proud of the record when it came out, but we kind of looked at each other and said, should we even call this a face-to-face record? You know, like, you know, Blake from Jawbreaker has a Jets to Brazil. Why don't we just come up with some different name and just not even say it's us and put it out there, and then we'll make a punk record for Face to Face. But at the end of the day, we decided to call it a face-to-face record, and then we really threw everyone a curveball with that album at the time. Now people love it in our catalog, but at the time people were like, this isn't punk rock. What the hell are you guys doing? So that was a little bit of an adjustment period too. That was kind of difficult, but we followed it up with Reactionary and then How to Ruin Everything, and How to Ruin Everything was our first actual proper Vagrant original album, which was cool. After we had, our live record was Vagrant's first full-length record.
Yeah,
that wasn't a compilation.
Well, the first, that East to West comp, right, is the very first Vagrant thing, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's just a series of it's a 7-inch box set.
Series,
I remember.
Yeah.
Eventually they would make CDs of it, but initially it was a box set of 7 inches.
A great series too, like unbelievable, the range of bands on that thing.
Oh yeah, the bands on that were impeccable. It was, and that, I mean, that's Rich Egan. He's always had a great ear for finding amazing bands. And when we did the live album with Vagrant, that gave them the clout and the finances to then go after bands like Get Up Kids and Saves a Day and Alkaline Trio, and then it just kind of snowballed on itself and kind of created that whole Vagrant sound. So we were there for the beginning of it, but I don't know if we were ever really a Vagrant band per se, but we were definitely part of the foundation of what would become that thing.
Well, it's interesting, I was bringing up with Fat Mike. I think it's the same with Vagrant, starting with your live record and ultimately everything that would kind of come after that. Like, it once again is kind of like a shift in the way people approach the, quote unquote business of punk rock, I guess. Like it was just a new approach to doing a label.
Yeah, for sure. definitely. And all those bands toured together. You know, we toured with them.
Mhm.
There were things they did that I think other labels would then start doing, like doing a very label specific tour, which wasn't a brand new idea. They used to do that in the 50s. You
Yeah.
know, put a bunch of bands in a bus together and go do the Shirelles tour. I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever, you know,
Yeah.
whatever the 50s label was. So that was kind of an idea that was recycled from then, but it worked, you know.
Well, even like, going back, like not that there would be a Fat Records tour until much later, but like it's almost like we had the Snow Jam Festival up here in Canada,
Yeah.
tour. You
Yeah.
had like this idea where it's like if you put these bands together and present people like here's a scene, it's much more, I don't know, it just makes sense.
Yeah. And it also helps solidify a lifestyle culture,
Yeah,
right? Because
absolutely. Yeah.
without without making people have to choose for themselves or figure out what fits with what, you're just kind of presenting it, and then people can just go, oh cool, yeah, I guess these bands go together and this is part of like a snowboard scene or whatever.
Trevor, this has been amazing. Would you come back at some point and do a part 2 in the future?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Before I let you go, can I ask you one more question that's like not bothering me, but I've always wondered in the video, did you guys place that Andre the Giant has a posse sticker on the takeout order thing?
Yes, the takeout order thing was a set piece. It wasn't even the proper takeout order speaker box for that restaurant that was there. We didn't use that at all. It had nothing to do with me. That was all part of the director and everything. I don't even think I was aware of what the Andre the Giant thing that was going on at the time was. So yeah, that was God, who directed that video? I can't remember now, but I know his name is on it. Cameron something or other, I believe.
I'll fix that in the intro too, because that video also, obviously a classic video, but so
Nice.
amazing that even that sticker, like once again, the small world we're in, like here's this guy that later on would become world famous for his Obama poster, but he had,
yeah.
And as a young person seeing that, being like, oh my God, it's all connected. I can't believe it. Like it was really a thread to follow.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's very cool. The director that shot that, he had done a No Use for a Name video that I liked a lot. So we called him based on that No Use video and asked him if he'd want to do this debt video. And we had the concept of the fast food thing, and he was all over it. So yeah, that was a good one. It was a fun video to make.
Awesome, Trevor. Well, thank you for the music, but also thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, man, it's been a pleasure. Before I go, I want to plug a couple things real quick, if you don't mind. So we just finished up our 10th studio album. I believe it's going to be called No Way Out But Through, and it's coming out on Fat Records. I hope either in the summer or fall of this year. So watch out for that. And it's not punk rock by any means of any stretch of the imagination, but I released a record with my son. It's an electronic ambient project called Icarus Daedalus.
Oh, wow.
And that came out last year. We just did a limited edition vinyl for it at the end of last year. And you can find that on Bandcamp, Icarus Daedalus. We have an Instagram, it's Icarus Daedalus Official, and YouTube is the same. So if you're looking to hear a completely different side of what I do and a collaboration with my son and I, which has just been such a blast. I know you have kids too. And when they're older and they're adult age, it's just a real pleasure to be able to do something creative with them and put it out. So just a little sideline. It's kind of a fun project for us. We're not on tour or anything like that. My son actually has a real job, and I'm the one in the house that's kind of a hack. So something to check out if you're interested.
That's a dream, like making music with your kids. Like that's yeah, like not that we haven't tried now, but it normally degenerates into fart noises at this point. So.
Which is fun, sure.
It definitely. I don't know if anyone needs it on wax yet, but we'll see. Is that almost like a throwback you feel to Zero Tolerance and the kind of sounds you were, obviously in a pop structure with Zero Tolerance, but in the stuff you're doing?
I think the technology part of it is because I've always had an interest in synthesizers and programming and production, using crazy techniques with effects and that kind of stuff. So I've been wanting to make ambient music for a while. And a few years ago, Charlie came to me and said, "Hey, we should do a record together." And he wanted to do something like an 80s throwback. And I said, I've been wanting to do an ambient project for a while. Would you want to do that? And he was kind of like, sure, yeah, okay. So I kind of brought him along into it. But then once we started writing songs, we both really got into it, and we made an album's worth of music. And yeah, I would say it kind of does tie in, at least to my interest in that type of instrumentation, which is something I don't do at all in punk rock. And I love making music, in a lot of different ways. Punk rock has just been my most dominant outlet, which of course I love and cherish. But it's cool to be able to create music in some different genres too,
Thank you, Trevor, for coming on the show. And you heard earlier there, Trevor will be back for a part 2. But don't forget to check out No Way Out But Through, coming out later on this year. As he said, hopefully later on this summer, maybe later on this fall, but on Fat Records. And also Icarus, Daedalus, which is awesome. It's kind of like a very much unlike Face to Face, but really cool project. So that is that. Speaking of that will be coming up later on this week on the show. The director of the CBC comedy series, the hilarious CBC comedy series, The Tall Boys, Bruce McCullough, will be on the show. That's right, from Kids in the Hall, from one of the greatest stand-up comedy records. No, it's not stand-up comedy. One of the greatest comedy records of all time, which begat probably the greatest 3-hour TV special on Much Music ever. No, definitely the greatest special on Much Music ever, hands down. That's right, Bruce McCullough's going to be here. It's awesome. I interviewed him one other time. It was on Q when I guested on CBC's Q for like a week. He came in, I interviewed him, and the last thing he said to me before we went off air was, "Oh yeah, and I got knifed at a Husker Du show," or I think he said a Dead Kennedy show. But anyway, and then we went off air, and afterwards I'm like, "Oh, dude, you got to tell me that story." He's like, "Well, I'll tell you when I come on your podcast." Well, here we are 4 years later, and Bruce is here. It's worth the wait, though. This is a fantastic episode. I'm gonna say it. Like, Bruce McCullough's taste in punk music is right up there with Robbie Brookside's. And that, if you listen to the show, that is some very high praise. Get ready. Buckle up. All right, that's it. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives of Indigenous people matter. We need to protect trans kids, and we need to help trans people protect themselves. And we need to stop hate and violence towards Asian people. Basically, we just need to, smash fascism and realize that these aren't political issues. These are just human rights issues. These are just issues that prevent people from living their lives in the way that we all want to live our lives, just freely and peacefully. So get informed, get involved, donate money to organizations and causes, and just be informed. Be informed from obviously real legitimate sources, but if you go out there and read what's going on in this world, I'm sure you will agree that we need to stand up and do something to make this place a little bit better. Speaking of making things better, try doing something creative. Make your own culture. Start a band, start a fanzine, start a podcast, draw a picture, do something, beating. Speaking about things that can make you feel better mentally, because that stuff can. I don't know if I said that. That stuff can. I tried meditating. I kind of confused it the way I said it there. I have tried meditating recently, and it's worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you. I don't know. Wear a mask. Give people distance. Sign your organ donor card. We'll get through this thing. Look at New Zealand. Look at Australia. There's shows going on there. I'm sure there's shows going on in a lot of places that probably shouldn't be having shows too, but there are things on the other side of this. So, all right, that's it. I love you, and I'll see you next week. Oh, and don't forget to check out Oil and Flowers with myself and my good friend Buddha Blaze, where we talk about cannabis. We talk about Spanibus when Spanibus happens, but we also talk about all sorts of stuff around these these times involving the beautiful plant. All right, that's it. See you next episode. Goodbye.